Alrighty, I have 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. So with that, we will go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Brad Wolfenden, and I'm here with EmberSec. I hope all of you are staying healthy and well and have enjoyed a holiday weekend. Today's session will be covering HIPAA compliance and HITRUST certification. Before we get started today, just wanted to walk you through a couple of reminders in terms of logistics. All of you, your microphones have been muted for the duration of today's session. They'll remain muted the entire time, but with that said, we do ask that you engage with our panelists via the chat box. That chat box can be found in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. So if you have any questions that come up or we touch on anything you would like for us to dive further into, please feel free to communicate that with us. As I said, we'll be moderating today's session. And we'll have a section of today's session reserved for some Q&A at the end. Lastly, today's session will be recorded and shared. This will be posted to our YouTube channel, and all of you that have registered for today's session will receive an email follow-up with a link to view today's webinar. During today, our session we've prepared, as I mentioned, covers HIPAA and HITRUST. So a brief snapshot of the agenda. We'll get started with a quick discussion of compliance in healthcare. From there, we'll move into sort of the HIPAA versus HITRUST conversation, discuss who needs it and why, and the impacts becoming HIPAA compliant or HITRUST certified can have for your business. The next section of today's webinar will discuss the HITRUST framework itself. So really a deep dive into dissecting the framework and the certification process. And then, as I mentioned, we will be wrapping today up with a panel discussion and a brief Q&A. Today's speakers, we are fortunate to have two gentlemen with us on the line. First and foremost, Mr. Ken Jenkins. Ken is the CTO of Bylight and founder of EmberSec. Ken comes to us with 20 plus years of information technology experience with a background largely in red teaming, pen testing, hunting, threat emulation, incident response, and systems engineering. Ken is also an avid capture the flag competitor and a technical mentor for the Cyber Patriot program. Next, we have Mr. Farouz Rafiq. Farouz is the EmberSec GRC practice lead, governance, risk, and compliance. He is a cybersecurity professional with specific interest in ICS, OT, and IIoT security, with a background in federal cloud compliance and industrial control systems across the energy, power, and manufacturing sectors. Lastly, Farouz is also the Atlanta chapter president of the Control System Cybersecurity Association International. So with that, I will kick it over to Mr. Ken Jenkins to give you a little bit of background on Bylight and EmberSec, and we will move forward. Ken?
Thanks, Brad. Appreciate the introduction. Before we get started, I'll give a little bit about our company. So Bylight Professional Services is a full spectrum IT services company, been in business almost 20 years. We provide network engineering, architecture review, design, provide hardware, software solutions, many managed services and technical services, primarily to the federal government. EmberSec is a division within Bylight, and we focus primarily on cybersecurity technical services solutions. They include governance, risk, and compliance, managed detection response, and technical services. So part of our governance, risk, and compliance is advisory, consulting, and then we are a third-party assessor organization for HITRUST. Our managed detection and response service, those are the advanced services that you generally find in a security operations center. And our technical services team provides red teaming, pen testing, vulnerability assessments, and threat emulation. Our team is primarily built from researchers, offensive and defensive operators, SOC analysts, and intelligence professionals. And we're glad to host this webinar today. Next slide, please. Into what is HITRUST, we wanted to kind of frame out what's going on in the healthcare sector as far as timeline. So dating back to 1996, that's really when HIPAA kind of was signed into law, and one thing to distinguish is it is a law. So there are requirements if you're handling healthcare information. So that's really kind of the genesis of when it began. And then in 2003, the protected health information was established, and as a type of data that had to be handled in a specific way. You fast forward to 2005, and healthcare records were becoming electronic, and there was rules established then for how you would process them, store them, and how they would be handled in transit. In 2006, it became criminal if you have mishandled PHI or any type of healthcare information. So the individuals could be pursued for civil action against covered entities. Fast forward to 2009, and HITECH was established, and this is really when there's a breach that providers have to report that there was a breach and disclose that. Progressing along, it's getting a little more serious from the genesis of '96 to how you handle a breach, and then finally there was as far as data in transit, there's specific encryption standards that were established for electronic patient health information. Along with that became so next slide. So HIPAA versus HITRUST. So they're not really in comparison, but what I want to highlight is that HIPAA is more the law itself that was signed into law in 1996, and it covers the full gamut of patient health information as is handled by doctors' offices, dental offices, nursing homes, pharmacies, you name it, government programs associated to healthcare, and HIT clearinghouses. Also, it's imperative that that patient health information is secured. So how do you do that? There's a lot of aspects to be able to cover on HIPAA itself. So that's a good framework to use is HITRUST. The HITRUST nonprofit organization established about 13 years ago, and it kind of overlaps with many of the requirements within the healthcare industry, to help with HIPAA compliance. One of the great things that I like about HITRUST is their MyCSF portal, their training and certifications requirements that they have for the third-party assessors, for the assessors themselves, and then the ongoing training. So you're having relevant staff stay trained up on this accredited body, and they have conferences also. So it's pretty straightforward framework that you really can keep up with. Of note, HITRUST does certify third parties. So we are, as I mentioned earlier, we are a third-party assessor organization, and HITRUST also allows companies to maintain certification via interim assessment. So we're required to, third-party assessor organizations are required to do interim assessments on their customers. So for Brad, I see a couple questions coming in. I think we'll catch those on the back end. Is that correct?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. And 2 or 3 questions have come in by now, maybe a couple more. I've been adding them to our Q&A that we have lined up for the end. So I'll ask Farouz to speak to the one just about his personal experience, and he can give that when you pass it off to him. But the others we'll tackle here as we wrap it up.
Yeah, sure. Okay, appreciate it. So if you're new to HIPAA, there's quite a bit to understand. It sets a precedence for handled, and as you see, it is signed into law, and there are fines associated with it. But HIPAA is kind of the governing law that protects PHI and EPHI. It's mandatory to report breaches, and it gets publicized. So you got to be proactive with how you handle the breach, how you report it, and how you protect, how you attempt to protect PHI. So similar to FSMA, there's visibility and authority, but it's applicable. HIPAA is clearly applicable to the healthcare industry. Next slide. So HITRUST again, it helps you bridge your accreditation. Helps you bridge compliance with HIPAA as a framework. The domains required as the requirement statements within the framework, and it helps cover several regulations and other frameworks include PCI. Next slide. So dissecting HITRUST, 19 domains within HITRUST, including a few domains that cover privacy. As far as like overlapping with HIPAA, HITAG, NIST, COVID, PCI, also addresses many privacy laws that states have. It overlaps with 1001. And then within the design framework itself, there's 14 control categories, and we'll get into those as Farouz takes over. There's many. What I really like about HITRUST is when you get started with it, there's ability to scope your company's requirements. So based on whether you're a services provider, a product provider, you're handling electronic medical records or patient health information. As you go through the questionnaire within MyCSF, it really kind of helps you narrow down where your covered information is and what's in scope for your organization. Next slide. So the industry adoption of HITRUST, there's some real reasons why it's being adopted. As you see on the slide here, you have a lot of overlap in regulatory requirements and different frameworks, payment card industry, NIST, and HITRUST has a really good blend of covering down on those. So Bruce walks us through the framework here shortly. You'll see the overlap. Beneficial this is specific to, initially specific to healthcare, but I will tell you that HITRUST is a agnostic, industry agnostic framework. So there's quite a bit of goodness on how it overlaps across these different requirements. Next slide. So how do you get started? So first thing you want to do is, do you need HITRUST? Establish if it's something your organization needs, once you have established it, it's either a requirement or it's a framework you want to have an accreditation for. You want to establish a relationship with HITRUST directly. There's a bit of building you want to do with HITRUST specifically, so you can start your self-assessment, and then you could begin to gauge your readiness. The next thing you can do is determine which security controls are going to be in scope by using the questionnaire, and whether you're ready to undergo that readiness assessment. That readiness assessment is an excellent way to determine deficiencies and remediate accordingly with full cert assessment. Additionally, you'll have a better understanding of your cybersecurity maturity, and what's expected. Companies are willing to undergo validated assessments. A lack of maturity does disqualify to undergo an assessment. So this is not something you want to take lightly once you do sign up for it. Next slide. So the role of a third-party assessor. So becoming a third party is quite a process to, for companies to have that relationship with HITRUST. They're required to have certified assessors on staff that have conducted the in-person training. They're also required to have quality assurance personnel trained on staff as well. And they can guide you through the process, but really the third party assessor org is there to assess you, not to provide advisory as you're going through. So this is purely to measure your maturity based off the requirements that HITRUST has published with their scoring matrix for requirement statements and across the various domains. So I'll stop here and I'll pass it over to Farouz to kind of walk through a little bit more about the rest of HITRUST.
All right. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen who are on the call. I hope that the material that's been presented thus far has been helpful. And I hope that the rest of the material upcoming aids you in your professional endeavors as you seek about going about your compliance objectives for your organization. We will dive a little deeper into the framework and the assessments and some of the considerations that any company, any organization ought to consider in their journey towards HITRUST CSF certification. HITRUST offers a total of 4 assessment types if you're considering undergoing the HITRUST CSF assessment. And the 4 assessments are outlined here as follows: a readiness assessment, a validated assessment, a targeted assessment, and a customized assessment. As Ken alluded to earlier, gauging your readiness is a critical factor in determining exactly what your tasks and action items ought to be internally as an organization, as you're comparing yourself or readying yourself up to undergo a full validated assessment. A readiness assessment allows your personnel to gauge exactly the maturity of your cybersecurity controls implemented within your organization, and whether or not you really have the serious maturity expected of any organization to have in place in order to undergo the full validated assessment. And of course, of all the 4 the assessment types outlined here, the only assessment type that is considered for certification is the validated assessment. The validated assessment results in 3 deliverables to the organization, and these includes the HITRUST CSF validated report, the NIST cybersecurity framework report, and the HITRUST CSF certification letter, and requires organizations to partner with an accredited third-party assessment organization to complete the process. The targeted assessment allows an organization to perform a spot check of sorts of their cybersecurity posture compared up to an authoritative source or a particular regulation as it affects the organization. And a customized assessment allows organizations to really customize their selection of requirement statements from the framework to perform customized tests of particular requirement statements as their organization sees fit for whatever compliance objective requirement they may be pursuing or may be interested in comparing themselves against. So next slide. At a very high level, we can summarize the assessment process into these steps outlined here. The first step, of course, subscribe to the HITRUST MyCSF portal. And as Ken alluded to earlier, again in the presentation, this is where your relationship with HITRUST personnel is very important, as the levels and the tiers of subscription for your MyCSF portal is quite important, and it will help you in the long run when you select the right tier, the right subscription to the MyCSF portal. And you will even find that the MyCSF portal itself can be a fantastic compliance management platform of sorts, as you track your existing risks, your corrective action plans, and as you make progress and improvements to some of your outstanding risks, and just generally tracking your overall cybersecurity posture in a organized fashion, right? So that's why the access and the subscription tier that you subscribe to is critical to the proper subscription level for MyCSF. And so when you're undergoing a validated assessment, and for the sake of time, we will focus on the validated assessment, as most organizations are, their goal is to achieve HITRUST certification. And so for the sake of time, we will focus on the validated assessment route for the rest of the talk. And so one of the first things that the the organization will create is an assessment object. The assessment object is effectively one of the most important things. It is the object that is undergoing testing. It is undergoing review during the entire assessment process. So the assessment object itself will be defined by risk factors as they pertain to your organization, to the geography of your operation, to the various laws and regulations that your organization may be subject to, whether or not privacy laws at the state level applies to your organization. So these are all the various risk factors. If you can kindly just go back to the previous slide, please. Thank you. So these risk factors are critical to defining the assessment object, and these are and the exact list of all the items that are part of the assessment objects it is quite comprehensive, and so when you define the risk factors, when you define the assessment object in the MyCSF portal, it is quite expansive, quite comprehensive in determining precisely what the requirements are for your assessment for your organization. And exactly what requirement statements, as a result, you are subject to for the assessment during the assessment process. Once your organization has selected and defined the assessment object completely, you will have to respond to the requirement statements to display your maturity for that particular control, requirement. And this is also your chance to attach evidence, attach various artifacts that support your response to the requirement statements. And so once you go through all of your requirement statements, the third-party assessment organization performs a review of your responses, reviews your artifacts, will have personnel on site when permitting. As of right now, due to the pandemic, HITRUST has issued advisories, an advisory to perform assessments remotely, but during normal non-pandemic circumstances, assessors will be on site to perform testing of artifacts, reviewing documentation, and also performing subject matter expert personnel interviews. And this is also where, after the process has been completed by the third-party assessment organization, this is also an opportunity where the 3PAL will work hand in hand with the HITRUST assessors, the HITRUST personnel that will review the assessment object in the MyCSF portal. They'll review the work that the 3PAL has performed, provide feedback, provide commentary, engage in dialogue as far as if all the requirement statements are sufficiently met, or if any other requirements are outstanding, and how to go about fulfilling those requirements. And so again, please keep in mind, this is a very high level overview of the entire process, but considering all the steps have been successfully achieved during these first few steps, it leads us to the last step in the process, which is the reporting and the certification stage. And as we discussed, there are a total of 3 deliverables to a successful organization in this endeavor, and they include the HITRUST CSF, the validated report, the NIST cybersecurity report, and also the HITRUST CSF certification letter. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, there are different levels and tiers of subscription to the MyCSF portal, and these will be covered during your relationship with the HITRUST when you're at the early stages, determining precisely which subscription level to enroll with. There will be options and considerations for you to evaluate prior to you making the decision. Next slide. So as we spoke about earlier, creating the assessment object is effectively scoping the entire engagement. As I mentioned earlier, what the object that undergoes assessment is the assessment object. The assessment object contains all the characteristics, all the requirements, all the various attributes that apply to your organization. And it is effectively the thing that you're attempting to certify. And so we will address the business units, the facilities, the departments, the applications, servers and database, network infrastructure, security systems, and other attributes of your organization in the assessment object. Whether or not your organization is interacting with third-party vendors who may access protected data, whether any payments are being processed, if PHI and EMR is being handled, and how many records are being handled. These are all considerations. And as I also mentioned previously, any applicable privacy factors, privacy laws that pertain to your organization. Next slide. And we spoke about the risk factors earlier. The risk factors are narrowed down to these 5 characteristics: general risks, organizational, geographical, system, and regulatory factors. What business units are involved, what teams are involved, who is responsible for the enclave that might be in consideration for assessment, geographical, such as is this a cross-border operation where now we have to worry about regulatory factors in a different jurisdiction, system factors, where precisely are my systems being hosted? Are they on-prem? Are they in the cloud? These considerations. And lastly, regulatory factors such as privacy laws and other PCI, for example, that's another regulatory factor. HIPAA itself is a regulatory factor. So all the various regulations that might be applicable to your organization are defined in the regulatory factors. Next slide, please. Ken spoke about the 19 domains that are in consideration during the validated assessment. These 19 control domains are they're reflective of some of the control families that you may have worked with in other frameworks, such as NIST 853. But as we covered earlier during our presentation, the HITRUST CSF framework was really modeled based upon some of the other existing frameworks in the industry, and so there are some similarities that you have here. So. So you know, the total number of control requirements that you may have during your assessment I'm not saying it will, but it may number in the 1800s. There are over 1800 requirement statements categorized across these 19 control domains that we have. So that's something to consider. But of course, you know, you may not see 1800 requirement statements, right? So it all depends on precisely what's in scope. So that's what's important here. So next slide, please. So each requirement statement can be implemented in a total of 5 levels of implementation maturity in your organization, and the level of implementation is what you'll be scored against, and we'll dive into scoring here shortly. And so any requirement statement can be implemented across 5 levels of implementation, which includes policy, process, implemented, measured, and managed. So what we mean here, whether a policy is defined, whether the procedure is fleshed out that abides by the policy, whether or not the control itself has been implemented in the organization in a mature, repeatable fashion, or whether it's just being done ad hoc, right? Let's just use, in this case, for example, vulnerability scanning. Are we performing repeating vulnerability scans across the environment? Are we reviewing the results? Are we looking at the vulnerability scan results and determining precisely what it is that we need to mitigate? We want to make sure that we're measuring these results and managed, right? So are we reviewing metrics over time to determine precisely how we're trending with particular scan results and scanning criterias? And are we modifying and adjusting our policies and processes as a result of those findings over time? So these are the various considerations at a very high level of precisely some of the criterias that the requirement statements will be evaluated against. So down here, the bottom half of the slide, you'll see a screenshot of a control requirement statement in the MyCSF portal, where your organization's personnel will measure and respond to the requirement statement and link the appropriate documentation for each requirement statement. And keep in mind, if you have lots of artifacts, evidence of your organization, they can be bulk uploaded to the MyCSF portal. That option is available. Next slide, please. So continuing on with responding to requirement statements, so when we look at the individual requirement statement and we're responding to exactly what level of implementation it has been performed within the organization, we will dive into illustrative procedures where we have guidance from MyCSF to determine precisely whether or not you are scoring yourself against what is expected. So for each level of implementation, HITRUST will provide you guidance and supplemental advisory as far as ensuring that the level of response and the correct response is guided and also accurate in terms of precisely what HITRUST is expecting for that response. So next slide, please. And so once you have gone through all of your requirement statements and just covering 2 slides on all the requirement statements actually does not do the entire process any justice, but for the sake of time, this is what we'll have to stick to. And once all the requirement statements that's in scope for your assessment object has been addressed, you will be submitting your assessment object over to the third-party assessment organization for them to review your responses. At a very high level, the third-party assessment organization, as we covered earlier, during non-pandemic times, will send personnel on site to work with your internal personnel in reviewing their documentation, your architecture diagrams, your policies, your procedures, any plans, incident response plans, disaster recovery plans, reviewing those plans, reviewing any other artifacts and evidence of you performing those particular things that you're saying on paper that you're doing. And we will perform technical testing. This includes penetration testing, vulnerability scans, and other means of extracting important data that's critical to evaluating overall risks. And last but not least, we perform personnel interviews. A lot of ongoing processes established within organizations occur via processes that are well known to the personnel within the organization. And so we will extract additional data from those interviews to determine exactly what you're saying on paper is true, and if it's being performed, and whether or not dedicated personnel are overviewing or performing those particular tasks. And so this is also the step in the process where we may require for you to perform additional testing. We may review your artifacts. We may review your evidence, your screenshots, and determine that, hey, this is not sufficient for what we're looking for. This is not sufficient towards the level at which HITRUST is expecting of us and their standards. So we may require for you to send in additional artifacts, to send in additional requirements, artifacts and evidence. So or perform another scan. That's performed at this step, and once we perform and we collect and review all the artifacts, your implementation of your controls, we will move on to reviewing risks and scoring them. So for the sake of time and the scope of this webinar, the risk scoring and the process involved will not be considered. It is quite a comprehensive process, but we will jump into some of the more important aspects here. So when we're reviewing risks, the requirement statements that you are responding to are scored from a range of 1- to a 5+. And any control domain during the assessment process that scores less than a 3 disqualifies your assessment object from attaining a HITRUST CSF certification. So, excuse me, you will receive, in the case of any of your control domains scoring less than a score of 3, you will receive a validated assessment report, and you will receive the NIST report, but you will not receive a HITRUST CSF certification letter. In order for, because any control domain that scores less than a 3 results in a control gap. HITRUST CSF certification requires organizations or assessment objects to complete the process with corrective action plans, CAPs, not gaps. Gaps indicate a lack of maturity for the control implementation. CAPs, on the other hand, corrective action plans, indicate that controls have been implemented at a sufficient and satisfactory level. However, there are some attributes that's lacking in a very mature implementation of that control. And in that case, HITRUST will expect you to work on these corrective action plans after you receive your certification. So at a high level, just to recap, there are 1,800 requirement statements. These requirement statements make up 156 control references, which in turn make up a total of 19 control domains, okay? The requirement statements, the scoring of the requirement statements drive the domain level scores, okay? Control references, scoring control references drives the corrective action plans that will result during the assessment, and scoring of each individual domain drives the certification outcome, right? So as I mentioned earlier, if you score less than 3 on your control domain, your assessment object will no longer be eligible for a HITRUST CSF certification. I will finish off this slide by summarizing in another way. I know it's just a little confusing, but if your requirement statement scores at a 3+ or higher, you will not score a cap or a gap. But if it is less than a 3, if it is less than a 3+, then we will determine whether or not the associated control reference is required for certification. If it's not, it will result in a gap only. But if it is in consideration for certification, it will we will determine whether or not the associated control reference scored at a 3+ or higher. And if it did, it will result in a gap. And if it did not, it will result in a corrective action plan. So next slide, please. So once all requirement statements and associated testing has been completed, the assessment object will be turned over from the 3PAL over to HITRUST. The 3PAL also submits a list of other deliverables to HITRUST in this process. And this is also the process where HITRUST works directly with the 3PAL in reviewing the assessment object. And in reference to the three-way relationship between HITRUST, 3PAL, and the client works directly with the 3PAL at all given times, and the 3PAL works directly with HITRUST at all given times. And the 3PAL acts as an independent moderator between the two parties during this entire process. The HITRUST personnel will perform their QA process at this stage, and they will review the submitted requirement statements. They will review their artifacts that we submitted and reviewed, all other associated evidence, artifacts, screenshots, any other material that will help and support your requirement statements in scope or in consideration within the scope for the assessment will be reviewed by HITRUST. If they require additional commentary, if they require additional clarification, if they require retesting, even this is the stage where those activities are performed. And considering the entire process completes successfully without any major issues, we will continue on to the next step. So next slide, please. And let's, for the sake of time, we will also consider that the assessment here completed without any significant gaps and resulted in corrective action plans, which is typically what we expect, and we have seen a lot of other companies that are undergoing the process. They will, considering that their cybersecurity controls are implemented at a quite mature level throughout the organization, they're coming into the assessment with a good posture, good maturity. We expect, considering no other issues arise during the process, that these organizations should be able to successfully achieve a HITRUST CSF certification with the appropriate reporting deliverables. So considering that we have successfully achieved that process, we move on to the last step in the process, step 7, where you will be given a validated assessment report that consists of all the findings and the results, and also the corrective action plans that were recorded during the assessment. You will also receive a NIST cybersecurity framework report. And lastly, the object of your desire will be the HITRUST CSF certification letter that effectively authorizes your system as HITRUST certified, and allows you to effectively pursue your business objectives by accomplishing this compliance requirement. So next slide, please. So once you have achieved certification of your system, you have to maintain your HITRUST certification. As we mentioned earlier, you will have corrective action plans during the assessment process, which is completely expected and reasonable. And but what's more important is that for your organization to continue improving these action plans and making sure that you have the appropriate artifact and evidence indicating that you are actually improving them. And this is really important because if during the interim review process, if HITRUST determines that your organization is not allocating the appropriate personnel, the resources, the time required to improve these findings, they may revoke your certification. So no organization wants that. And so the process of maintaining your certification is performed via the annual interim assessments. The certification will have a 1 year of duration before it expires. So it's important that your organization teams up with a accredited 3PAL and goes into the interim assessment process in a timely fashion so that your certification doesn't expire. At a high level, the steps involved, as we mentioned, select your 3PAL that will be performing your interim assessment, make any updates to your scope. If any scopes changed, right? Any of the risk factors that we covered, if they change, that may require for us to make additional considerations during the interim assessment. Review the questionnaire, review updates to the questionnaire in the CSF portal. And what's interesting about the interim assessment is that the MyCSF portal will randomly pick 19 requirement statements covering the 19 control domains. So during the assessment, the interim assessment process, you will have to review those requirement statements and complete them the same way you did during the actual validated assessment. And so once those 19 requirement statements have been completed, you will have to show improvements and any updates for your action plans that were recorded during the validated assessment. Provide us the appropriate evidence, the artifacts, we review it, and we will engage with the HITRUST again for a QA process. And once they review all the activities and all the deliverables from your organization to the MyCSF portal, will determine whether or not an interim review letter is issued authorizing your accredited and certified system another year of continued certification and compliance to the HITRUST CSF. And so this summarizes the entire process and the 7 steps that guide an organization's approach to HITRUST, undergoing the process, and working with the 3PAL, working with HITRUST, and eventually accomplishing the validated assessment reports and the certification letter, and maintaining that. So and really just keeping it active and continually improving the organization's cybersecurity posture by improving these various risks within in scope of the assessment. So that concludes the HITRUST assessment process and how to maintain it. I will pause here and turn it back over to our moderator, Brad.
Excellent. Thank you, gentlemen. Fruz, that was quite the deep dive. Really appreciate all the time you spent putting those slides together. And it's quite clear that you know a thing or two about the HITRUST process. And Ken, thanks for sort of setting the stage there, reviewing the landscape and kind of explaining the differences between HIPAA and HITRUST. Moving forward, it seems like we've had a pretty decent amount of engagement through the chat box. And thank you for all of you that are on the line today, lobbing some questions at us. I think a few of them have been answered throughout the session. Some of those that came in earlier before we had a chance to really dive into the content for today. One of them, though, Firuz, this individual must have been pretty impressed with your portion of today's session, and they're curious, how many years of experience do you bring to the work that you've been doing here at EmberSec?
Yeah, Michael Frederick has had quite some interesting questions, most of which, Michael, if you have any, I think for the sake of time, it would probably be better for us to continue over emails addressing those questions. But as far as direct experience in the field, I really got started in being a practitioner in the field before I graduated university. So I would say roughly over 11 going into 12 years of experience across various fields of information security, as covered in the first few slides. You can visit me on LinkedIn and connect with me and send me any other direct questions you may have regarding my past history. Be glad to answer any further questions about that topic.
Thanks, Firuz. And Ken, another attendee today was asking a little bit more about your slide on the business impact of pursuing HIPAA compliance and HITRUST. I know from some of the groups that we've worked with in the past, you might have some sort of firsthand examples of the limitations that businesses may face based off of their lack of compliance or lack of certification. Do you care to chime in on a few of those?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Brad. It's actually a good question. So, some of the things I've seen is when organizations want to partner with larger companies or hospitals or, different business units within healthcare, they, generally companies are looking for some kind of third-party security assessment to make sure that if they're going to be sharing data or they're going to have some trust between their organizations, that they want to see a bit of maturity. So gone are the days of the long 800 question surveys where you kind of self-report on yourself. And now it's, do you have HITRUST? So I've noticed the iterative process where larger requests that, hey, do you have a self-assessment? Can we see the output of your self-assessment? Can you show us your roadmap to getting HITRUST? And then finally, once you get HITRUST, how are you dealing with your caps? So what I've seen is, it can impact partnerships. It can impact the ability to respond to requests for proposals, and just overall in general, as revenue streams can potentially be impacted, which could have exponential effects as far as partnering and getting your either your service or your products to market.
Right. Cool. Thanks, Ken. And for the sake of time, maybe just one or two more. This one might be a quick hitter for you, Ken. This individual is asking for an explanation of the difference between who can conduct a pre-assessment or self-assessment and the actual HITRUST assessment.
Yeah, that's another good question. So, HITRUST has internal assessors now. So, anyone can conduct their own pre-assessment or self-assessment, but you really want to look for someone who does advisory and consulting to help with your pre-assessment. With the self-assessment, the company itself, or the organization, whoever is looking to gain a HITRUST assessment or want to just really score themselves and see where they're at, scope and maturity-wise, what would have to mitigate to be able to achieve an actual HITRUST accreditation. To answer your question about HITRUST assessments, that requires a third-party assessor organization. And again, on the HITRUST site, there's a list of companies that are certified third-party assessor orgs. They're the only ones that can submit, well, the only ones that can conduct the assessment, and then also they get assigned once you sign up for HITRUST, and you start going through your assessment, and they also submit you to the quality assurance team, and then walk you through those steps.
Great, thank you. And we'll wrap up. This seems like a pretty fitting question. And Farouz, we'll start with you on this one. Ken, if you have any comments to add in after Farouz takes a shot at it, feel free. But we went through a pretty deep dive dissecting the actual HITRUST framework and certification process. This individual is asking, what is a realistic timeline to achieve certification? And like I said, Farouz, I'll start with you on this one.
Sure, Brad. Thanks for the question. That's a really good question. We get asked that question a lot. So let's take a step back for a second. For any serious compliance requirement for cybersecurity, and that's for almost any compliance requirement you can think of, that requires some serious effort, some serious consideration, investment, personnel, time, and money, right? It requires a bit of project planning and a lot of investments into what it is that you're trying to get done, and so it requires a lot of people to kind of come to the table and be on the same page, and it requires creating a security program from the ground up. That is no easy task. That itself can take up to a year, I mean, at the very least, considering that you can move fast. So establishing a team that's on the same charter, interfacing with the various team leads, interfacing with the executives and other external personnel that may be driving your cybersecurity program considerations internally. Once you can get the base layer foundation kind of in place, then you start looking at some of the specific requirements within the compliance framework that you're trying to comply with, and in this case, HITRUST. Once you determine what all those requirements are, the maturity expected of each cybersecurity control practice requirement within the organization, implementing them, being able to display the repeatability in implementing and performing that control, collecting the artifact, collecting the results, reviewing the results, and then comparing metrics over time, over a month, 2 months, a quarter. And so once you can really implement all of your controls up to that granular level of implementation and maturity, it indicates that your cybersecurity program is at a satisfactory level, or perhaps a level of consideration for some of these mature compliance requirements, such as HITRUST CSF. And that entire process, Brad, can take anywhere going from having nothing in place to attaining your certification. The day you're issued the certification letter can take anywhere between 1 year up to 2 years, 2.5 years. It all really depends on your maturity and processes in place.
Got it. Thanks, Farouz. Well, folks, that does put us at the end of our time today. Again, thank you to all of you that have joined us for today's session. And another thank you to Ken and Farouz for all of your hard work putting together this presentation and I really appreciate all the information you've shared with us today. If you have further questions or wish to reach out, as we've mentioned, EmberSec is a third-party assessor organization. So if you are on your journey to HITRUST and would like some support with that, we'd love to help you. Feel free to reach out. We can start with a bit of a consultation and move from there. Our contact information is on the screen. We also manage both a blog that can be found on our website, embercybersecurity.com, and have both an active Twitter and LinkedIn page. So feel free just to give us a follow there, and we'll look forward to connecting with you in the future. Have a great afternoon, and thanks again.